So welcome everyone to the Power in Numbers information session. We are really excited to share some of the work that we've been exploring over the past few years with regards to data and building collaborations, and also excited to introduce a bit of the technology platform that we've been working on to support this initiative as well. My background is actually in healthcare and medicine, and my undergraduate degrees in biology. So finding my way back to research and data and ecosystems has really always been a part of how I've seen the world. And so the privilege to do this through my community development work has really been great to return to. I am the executive director of New Sun Rising. My name is Scott Wilovich, and I know that we have a number of folks from not only the southwestern Pennsylvania region, but throughout the country and possibly beyond, due to some partnerships that we've been building over the past year. Our friends at SOPACT and folks at the Connecting Dreams Foundation, nationally and internationally, have been really great thought partners in this work. So I would encourage folks to liberally use the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself, your name, the location you're attending from, and if there's anything that you'd like folks to know about you. So I do want to acknowledge the New Sun Rising team that's put in a lot of sweat equity on this. As a lot of folks know, in the startup world as well as nonprofits, you often are doing a lot of unpaid work to set the foundation for these types of initiatives. And I know in particular, Dan Steiker, who is our director of operations, has really been able to leverage a lot of his experience in technology development and process design to help get us to this point. So certainly appreciate that. And so what is the new, the Power in Numbers initiative? And New Sun Rising really believes that all organizations and communities should have access to the information and technology necessary to reach their goals. And we know as nonprofits, as community leaders, we have access to a ton of information. One of my favorite learning experiences was with one of our partners, Michelle Walker of Walker Philanthropic, and where she really challenges community organizations and nonprofits to think about the information they have as intellectual property. We often don't do enough with that intellectual property. We don't acknowledge it, and we don't recognize the power that it has. And so part of this initiative is that recognition that we sit on a ton of data, and we need to start thinking more intelligently about how we put that to use. We also know that nonprofit and social enterprise leaders who regularly use data have better outcomes. And we've learned that through some really groundbreaking and foundational research done by our friend Sherry Cheney Jones through a book called Impact and Excellence. And so while we know that when people commit to this, they have better outcomes, we also know that unfortunately, most don't have the time, experience, or the resources to do so. And so this Power in Numbers initiative was launched to help leaders strengthen their data culture, really help them to create a greater impact. And so we're not only providing technical assistance and support through data visualization and report creation, but also through the technology portal to help them unlock the power of the information that they have. We've had support for this initiative through some of our investors like the Pittsburgh Foundation, Google through the Tides Foundation, and the Henry L. Hillman Foundation as well. And so today we're going to get into some characteristics of systems and power, looking at the role of the Sustainable Development Goals, how some limitations in our own capacity building and investment framework led New Sun Rising to really think about data and collaboration. And if I don't suck all the air out of the room, we'll have some time for Q&A here at the end. But just to remind you, this is really as much of a conversation as we can have. I really encourage folks. I'm excited to see people already using the chat liberally, and would encourage you to continue to do so. And so what are numbers? The word itself can signal different things to different people. Most commonly, it refers to the numeric system, that was developed by ancient civilizations in Egypt, Greece, and India. But it can also signal a gathering of people. And for example, there is a group in the Amazon, Paraha society, that their language has no representation of numerical concepts. They simply don't count things. They don't have language for that. And so even without the concept of numbers, as we commonly, most frequently understand them, they certainly are still able to understand that there is a power in the number of people coming together to achieve their shared goals. And the anthropologist who really learned from the Paraha people and made these observations also puts forward this statement, and that mathematical concepts are not wired into the human condition. They're learned, acquired through cultural and linguistic transmission. And so if they are learned rather than inherited, then it follows they are not a component of human mental hardware, but very much a part of our software. And so I just want to reflect on this for a moment, because I do believe that we sometimes put more power in these numbers than we recognize. And it's really the human interpretation, the human application of how we use these numbers in our own work, the narratives that we spin from them, that is really the part that makes these mathematical concepts even possible. And so that human element is super important as we talk about technology, as we talk about things like artificial intelligence, predictive analytics. We know that there's the potential for the human side of this to get stripped out of all of data work. But we really want to go back to this foundational concept that through research, we know that this is a human phenomenon, and that all numbers and concepts related to them are actually translated through our cultural and linguistic factors. And so research also shows that the most powerful thing that holds our systems in place is our mindset. It's not incentives, it's not penalties, it is the narrative that we have and the shared mindset that we have. So what is the role of numbers and information then in building narratives that help to determine these mindsets? How do we use numbers to create shifts in narratives that not only inspire inclusive systems, but also for the ability of these marginalized groups to co-create and build power from within them? And so when we think about the different aspects of systems thinking, it's important to understand these key characteristics and the implications that they have for how we work within them and how our data work applies to them. The first of the four characteristics, as described by FSG, is that contextual factors can really make or break your work. And I think we all know this doing social and community work. Not understanding the history of organizations and communities, not understanding cultural factors can certainly create issues that can derail things before they even get started. The second is around our connections. And so relationships between entities are equally or more important than the entities themselves. It's a really important point to understand in systems work, that it often is the relationships more so than the individual entities. And so when we think about data and we think about collaboration and scaling social impact, we really have to have an even greater emphasis on developing and understanding these than we currently do. Cause and effect in systems is not linear or predictable. So often our data models will try to really restrict our thinking about predictable or unidirectional patterns. But the reality is that in systems and our complex social challenges that we're working towards, these patterns emerge from different agents and at different levels of the system. And lastly, systems cannot be understood from any one perspective. So when we're thinking about designing data initiatives and collaborative approaches, we really have to understand that multiple perspectives are required. And so the impact of your data and narrative building work will be limited without considering the systems in which they exist. And so in order to do that, we really encourage folks to think about designing efforts with an understanding and an appreciation for the context, the connections, the patterns, and the perspectives that are part of your work. And so it shouldn't be a surprise for anyone that's been paying attention. Our world, the societies we live in, the economies that we contribute to and benefit from are all in a state of transition. And I saw these prior to COVID. We know that COVID has only amplified a lot of the transition that's underway. And so anyone that's working in with respect to these challenges really knows and can understand that these social challenges are extremely complex in nature. And the systems that we live within are organized. There is organic development of these systems, but there's certainly a heavy institutional or human element that helps to organize these systems. And we also recognize that when people organize and there are financial resources involved, that results in power. And so the topic of power is something that can be a difficult one, both for the people who don't have power and those who we're asking to relinquish power. I've seen people run towards this word and I've seen people run against it, but it's certainly something that needs to be called out and considered. Power and energy as two concepts are related, but they're different. And while we think about energy as being a word that's used to describe the work being done, power by definition is energy over a certain unit of time. And so the idea of power by definition, it has an urgency to it. It has a time component to it. It's bringing people and money together to accomplish something over a certain amount of time. And that urgency is something that's important to consider. So knowing that many ecosystems that we work within are better equipped than the social sector at developing complex organized power, how can we better understand and apply these concepts to scale up our social change? We know that data-informed decision-making has been widely adopted and incentivized to drive performance in corporate settings, even in professional sports. Why aren't they more developed in the social sector? And the reality is, like all of this work is it's complex. We, I think, look often, or we work often from a scarcity mindset instead of a mindset of abundance. We often look to our investors, our grant makers, our donors, and have a hard time expressing the value proposition of why investing in data and collaborative work is important. There's been an overabundance of siloed thinking and approaches, more competition often in our communities and our sector than collaborative approaches. There are histories and personalities in all of the communities and all of the organizations that we work in that come into play. And frankly, there's a lack of exemplars. The best practices and use cases where these things are working are important to lift up. And so the work that unifies our approach to building this power in numbers campaign really hinges on our commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so really thinking about recognizing that all businesses, all life forms produce waste in some ways. We all produce some sort of negative externality or negative impact. But we want to look more holistically at how can we maximize positive social returns and minimize negative impacts. And so in 2015, the world leaders from almost 200 nations agreed on these Sustainable Development Goals, looking at eliminating things like hunger, poverty, climate change. And while they've been established globally, the goals provide this common framework for stakeholder efforts to be organized. And what we found to be most powerful is they work across a couple of different axes that tend to be difficult to bring people together in conversation. The first is around the different level of the system that's actually being engaged. And so we find that whether you're working hyper-locally, regionally, nationally, or internationally, folks can come around these goals and have conversations about what they mean to them. It also works from the lens of the sector that's involved. And so we've found that often the language used by governments, nonprofits, corporations, and citizens tend to be different, and there is often a need to translate in between them to really have collaborative work happen. The SDGs allow these different sectors to consider their unique position, but also have some shared language that can be developed. There are 4 key principles with the SDGs. First, the goals are universal. They apply to nations, communities that are developed and developing. They're intersectional. Issues in one area will have an effect on the others. So it's really important that work is coordinated and collaborative. Secondly, the goals look at a very broad view of sustainability, social progress, environmental protection, economic development are all part of this triple bottom line approach that helps people and really requires them to balance investments and strategies. The third principle for the Sustainable Development Goals is that no one should be left behind. And so the progress without the inclusion of those in society who are most vulnerable will continue to create more challenges for the broader community. And so education has to reach more indigenous populations and folks who don't have the resources that are invested into their systems. Jobs have to be created equitably for all races and gender identities. Healthcare has to be more accessible for harder to reach populations like rural communities, and oppressed people should be centered in decision-making and partnerships. And finally, the goals need to be engaged really from all aspects of society, the private sector, academia, and it's really about having these frequent conversations that lead to action. And so with this adoption of these Sustainable Development Goals and a commitment to them, we started thinking more and more about how we actually implement or how we help to get to action through this Vibrant Communities framework that we've developed. The first phase of this typically lasts a year or longer, and this Ignite phase focuses on discovery, idea refinement, collecting and interpreting different qualitative or quantitative data. The results of this are, building a lot of relationships, trust, a shared sense of identity. The second phase that we really had supported a lot of folks through is this launch phase that is helping to develop organizations, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, through an approach that can be called total capital. So thinking about not just financial capital, but the knowledge capital and social capital that can be brought to bear. And that typically lasts 6 to 12 months. And so between the years of 2015 and 2018, we really focused on this ignite and launch strategies and witnessed a number of organizations and communities making significant progress towards their goals. But we also recognized that there was a ceiling or a cap to this opportunity. And we were igniting and launching them into a system that was not necessarily welcoming or ready to significantly invest to grow or scale up those efforts. And so we really started wanting to dig deeper in that and understand why it was and what elements of those systems needed to change, and frankly, what our role in that system change could be. I want to give a shout out to the NeighborWorks Training Institute for any of those of you that have been able to attend an NTI. These are offered multiple times a year through the National Training Institute of NeighborWorks. Just phenomenal educational opportunities and professional development. I took a course there on advocacy, which really helped to shape and provide clarity to what our role it was in the larger advocacy work. And so as we analyzed our data around capacity building and making financial investments, who were we investing in? What goals were they trying to address? Where were we as an organization investing our time across these different domains of ignite, launch, and grow? And who was scaling? Who were the positive deviants, if you will? Why were they scaling? Not just in terms of the number of people being served. We often think of scaling up, but we like to describe this more through the different dimensions of the depth and the breadth of scaling as well. You can scale by serving people deeper, for instance. And so the question started to come up: what barriers exist in the current system that inhibit nonprofits, social enterprises, and communities and their ability to grow? And we strategically considered what role we could play in this space of advocacy in order to help drive policy engagement. But we really saw some more foundational strategies like community organizing, narrative building, and helping others to be more competitive for resources that seemed like really necessary and important work to set the stage for policy advocacy. And so in late 2018, the seeds for this Power in Numbers initiative that we're launching today were planted as we committed to advocate for scaling change through these joint strategies of data and collaboration. The Power in Numbers initiative is really focused on three larger buckets of work, and I would encourage you all to kind of think about how you're applying this in your own initiatives as well. We're really doing a lot of data collection or information gathering and helping other nonprofits and communities to do that as well, not only from a quantitative perspective, but also the qualitative perspective that we know our nonprofits are really great at. It's a matter of capturing that and then moving into the next phase, which is analyzing and reporting on that information. So how do you manage your data? How do you visualize it? We've come up with some weekly challenges to just set a cadence and help people to create a discipline around analyzing their data, and then generating reports and storytelling out of that. And at the end of this, it's really about turning this into action. So how does this drive, concepts of collective impact, of getting into more impactful partnerships, driving narratives, that can help you with your advocacy or help you to scale and bring more resources to bear for your work? What is the role of community engagement? So how do we bring, these numbers, which really don't start without people, and often those are your clients and your community members, as we put them into this machine and analyze and create reports back out, it's critical to bring those back to your community and to your clients and to share that conversation to find out what you might have missed, what they see, how they're interpreting it. And that cycle just continues. And then lastly, there's action around policy advocacy, as we had talked about, a number of people doing really great work around setting policy platforms and really finding out what your role is to help them achieve wins around policy that can ultimately support your work. Well, I did want to go back and just real quick at the bottom there, shout out our research team. So we worked with Beam Data, Walker Philanthropic, and Tad Hale to help set the foundation for this work, which was funded by the Forbes funds. And our development team, which is anchored by Civic Mapper. And we had 3 fellowships that actually were student-led teams that set a lot of the foundations for this work. And we've had our AmeriCorps Vistas working really hard on this as well. So capacities come from all places. So the first area there is around collecting information. We have 4 different domains in our data management system that we are working towards collecting data. And so the first is the community indicator data. This is more typically your census data or neighborhood level data, impact metrics, organizational health and resilience, and then asset mapping. And so we'll go through each one of these a bit. The Vibrancy Portal that we have actually brings these different data sets together and supports the leaders of nonprofits, of collaboratives, and investors like foundations to get better insights on how they're operating and what impact they're having. So the community indicators are expressed through our Vibrancy Index. And so this was developed initially through a fellowship program with university students, and it helps people to answer this question. What are the baseline conditions of the community I'm serving, and how do they compare to others? And we think this baseline is critically important. This index tool allows people to look across the different domains of the SDGs, also looks at larger buckets of culture, sustainability, and opportunity, and really allows people to drill down deeper into the different areas that they're serving. Vibrancy Index scores, interestingly, have allowed us to kind of follow this legacy of disinvestment that places like Pittsburgh and many other communities throughout the country and world have experienced. And so on the left, we have this federal housing policy that has been, more commonly referred to as redlining. We look at our overlay of the Vibrancy Index, and we can see that those communities that were redlined and disinvested in the 1930s continue to have decreased levels of things like economic opportunity, racial and gender equity, and environmental sustainability than others. And we know also that drives narrative over time. A local institution created this map to guide their students towards communities that they felt that they should visit. And so you can see how policy, actual on the ground indicators of how people are thriving and what the vibrancy looks like in their communities almost 80, 90 years later, and the narratives that are told, they're all connected and they're all woven together. So we use this Vibrancy Index to really help illuminate that answer of getting those baseline conditions. The next domain of data that we capture through this is around impact measurement. And so we started really doing research on different platforms to help us organize and collect impact data for individual organizations, as well as portfolios or groups of organizations. And we were really committed, again, to have this data tagged by the Sustainable Development Goals. And that led to our partnership with SOPACT and Impact Cloud, which as a platform has allowed us to collect through surveys this information, have this data visualizations created, and for us to be able to produce dashboards and data viz that can actually be brought to bear within the portal itself. So a social enterprise or a nonprofit leader can complete these surveys and actually view these data points within the platform. The third area of our Vibrancy Portal is around organizational health and capacity. And so once we understand the conditions of the community that are being addressed, what you're doing to address them, what your impact is, we also want to know how healthy are you as an organization? What is your capacity? And how can you, by identifying the weaknesses in your organization, bring to bear different resources to improve them? We have 4 areas of planning, connectivity, resources, and identity that we screen. And we also are able through the platform to provide comparative data to show how your organization compares more broadly across the different folks in our database. We're also able to filter that based on the sustainable development goal that you're looking to address and the size or budget of your organization. And then lastly, the area around asset mapping and building collaborations. We think it's critically important to connect nonprofits, social enterprises, and communities to others who are doing related work. So this aspect of the platform helps people to identify strategic partners that can help them to achieve their goals. The screenshot in front of you, for instance, is looking at New Sun Rising's fiscal sponsorship portfolio. So we're able to drill down and look at a subset of the organizations that we're supporting. We can then filter it out based on the SDGs. So this is looking at all of our fiscally sponsored projects that are addressing SDGs related to culture and opportunity. And so all of this is configurable and can really help both individual organizations, intermediaries, and investors to get a better sense of how they can connect with and support the people that they're working. And if you remember back, so that was the first section, which was around collecting information. The second was really around analysis and reporting. And so we have a bunch of tech-assisted data visualizations, geolocation, filtering, comparative ways within the portal to do this. And while we do recognize that the technology certainly helps and assists in that matter, this is very much a human process. And I always like to say that we know that technology and robotics are being used for a lot of different things. We have to train some of the robots to do good. So at the point of the singularity, we have a chance here. But there's still a role for humans, very much a big role for humans in all of this process. Data analysis, bringing community and staff members around the visualizations and the reporting, graphic design, and storytellers are super important to this analysis and reporting phase of the work. We're also working on looking at bringing big data into this initiative. So how can we use web scrapers to pull information, publicly available information, generate machine learning classifiers so that we can structure that data and then have that brought to bear through this portal so that our individual nonprofits and communities can have more access to a larger data set. We're also looking at different predictive analytics initiatives. We have 3 teams right now, 1 from Pitt and 2 from CMU that are working on different aspects of this initiative. And on the bottom right is an example of a prototype for the type of data storytelling that we're looking to generate out of this. We do have some partners like Riverwise, who's working out in Beaver County, who's actually embedded a videographer within their team. And so they've been capturing a lot of video content and stories in that way. We're thinking about a spectrum of data stories and how this technology can actually help a small grassroots organization to use this data to actually create compelling content and continue to increase the impact that they're having. The most important part in all of this is, at the end of the day, is to take action around this work. So we know that we internally use data and insights and these processes for performance improvement. We know that there's an opportunity to develop more collaborations and connect people in different ways around data. We know there's opportunities to explore shared infrastructure, and that can be operationally through shared financial or administrative operations, measurements, and facilities. We talked about community engagement and policy advocacy already. We are in conversations with Be the Change, which is an app that really helps to connect citizens to legislators around issues of local importance and really creates a direct communication channel between them. And so we started to explore what it might look like to connect our technology and the folks we're working with apps and companies like Be the Change. And so I would encourage you as a civic tech example to look up Be the Change and potentially reach out if there's any interest potentially in learning more about what they're doing. And we're looking forward to exploring that with them as well. One of the actions that we've really invested deeply in is this idea of developing collaborations. In our Vibrant Communities framework, this is in our third phase, our grow phase, and it's the third strategy, which is the 3.3. We've kind of created our own Dewey Decimal System here for how we track our own activities across all of these different strategies. But the Collective Impact Forum has a different framework for the 5 elements of collective impact. And we've been working to either support or through active participation and sometimes funding a number of collective impact initiatives that you see on the right there. They are spanning place-based initiatives, multi-municipal initiatives, initiatives that are focused on specific aspects like community development or sustainable development. And so really trying to look at this idea of using data to create a common agenda, to collectively define the problem that's being solved and a shared vision to address it, working on this idea of shared measurement, committing to tracking progress in the same way, analyzing the data to continue to improve. Mutually reinforcing activities are really looking across your existing efforts of all the partners and maximizing the desired outcomes that you have. The continuous communication is probably the most important one. I see some folks on attending the meeting today who've been a part of our collective impact work, and we've actually participated in their collective impact work. I'm sure every one of them will tell you that it's a time investment, it's an investment in trust and relationship building, and the only way you get there is through regular, frequent, and honest communication. And then lastly is this concept of backbone support. So what aspects of a collaboration need to be committed to by some sort of outside capacity, and that can be administrative, data management, fundraising are a few areas that typically holds true. There's definitely a mindset or a shift that happens as folks move from this sort of micro level or grassroots level of leadership up to what we're talking about in terms of more systems level leadership. And there's some work that's happening with Connect and some other regional partners like Sustainable Pittsburgh that is going to be helping people to think more about the types of leadership that's required to really build and invest in networks. And so I would just encourage people to think about where you're at and who you're supporting within these broader ecosystems, and how different types of leadership need to be brought to bear. And I would think with data, this certainly holds true as well. All right, and my last kind of closing thought here before we turn it over to some Q&A is the idea of building data culture. And so I referenced Sherry Chaney Jones earlier in the call. Her book around impact and excellence really lifts up and provides a lot of research to this slide on the left. And in summary, it shows that high data cultures result in high performing organizations. And that's across a number of different domains, whether that's fundraising, internal and external communication. There are a lot of benefits to doing the work necessary to build strong data culture. And so these data norms on the right are actually an example of some that came out of a collaboration that we're participating in, that's led by one of our partners. But I wanted to just give people a sense of the types of things that we're talking about in that work, because I do think that data initiatives can be scary. Sometimes people don't know where to start. And I think the idea of starting to build that data culture within your community, within your organization, is the first place. And so we talk about data as a starting point, not an end point. We use data to inform and enrich the work, not as a punishment. We respect confidentiality and only share when we agree upon beforehand. It's not something that we just do periodically. It's embedded within the business, both qualitative and quantitative, and that you have to be willing to get out of your comfort zone. You're going to see and hear things that aren't necessarily maybe what your assumptions were coming into the data, and so you have to be open to seeing that. And so the importance here is that doing work around building a data culture is a discipline. It has to be developed. It's a muscle that has to be exercised. Most importantly, it has to be valued. So each one of us is pulled in 1,000 directions. There's in any given day, there's a lot of things we can be doing with our time. How do you find the way to build discipline towards the data related work? And how can you start with building that culture? Culture are norms, values, and behaviors. So how do you start to embed norms, values, and behaviors related to data within the organizations and initiatives that you're working on? And with that, we'll wrap up the presentation side of this. I have not been following the chat, so I would actually encourage folks to because we do have a number of people on the meeting, to bring anything up in the chat, or if any of the New Sun Rising staff want to help in surfacing any questions, we can do that there as well.
We have been monitoring, and we are waiting for any questions. Feel free to put it in the chat.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
You talk about your business processing data in essence, right, and producing an outcome. And then at the end, you talked of that the information is maintained, used, like it's a collaboration and how this data is going to be used, right? Agreed?
I would say both are true, but not mutually exclusive.
Right. I'm trying to understand the process, like on the integrity of the data, like how is it used, or what, can you give an example of what the process is to compile customers' data, or right, a client's data, and then like how do you hash out or protect that information for how do you carve it in essence? Or how do you decide what the rules are?
Mhm.
Is that
Sure. Yeah, I can address that. So anyone who contributes their data, so any data that is collected, is only made available for that organization's use unless permitted otherwise. And by that, I mean the collective impact or the collaborative work. So if, John, you're participating in this platform just as your organization, you would have access to your information only. If you were part of let's say there's 5 organizations that are all working together to reduce hunger, and you're part of that collaborative, if you all have given permission to share that data, that is something that can be accommodated within this platform. The only time that data is used outside of your permission is in an anonymized way, and that's for the comparative data. So nothing is individually identified, nothing is shared. It's pushed into a larger anonymized pool for things like our capacity scores and things along those lines. The only information that's really available in the asset mapping or the collaborate tab in this tool is publicly available information, really just who the organization is, what sustainable development goal they're addressing, and how you might reach them through their website.
great? Thank you.
Sure. But I
Scott,
would,
we do have,
oh, go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to say that we do have some questions in the chat.
Yeah, I see a number of questions related to confidentiality that I definitely appreciate. Connie talks about this balance between confidentiality and sharing. Some of that I addressed in the previous comments, but as we continue to build this out and find new use cases related to this, that's absolutely something that has to continue to be looked at. I mean, we're right now releasing this in a pretty controlled environment, if you will. We have a smaller group of folks that we have worked with over time as New Sun Rising, and we're kind of launching it with that initial cohort. But we've been in conversations with other intermediaries, for instance, or potentially funders, and if and when those relationships are brought to bear, there's a lot of data sharing agreements and confidentiality that would have to be developed and talked through at that time. But just to reiterate, the only data that becomes part of any public view is anonymized and scrubbed from any individual recognition. Let me see. So the fear of data, Terry asks about organizational cultures and how to address the fear of using data. I think that's a really good one. And at the end of the day, I think it really comes down to giving people ownership and making sure that people are fully included and that they have ownership over what's being used, how they're using it, and that they're embedded within the process, so that the data initiative is not something that is happening to them. It's actually that they are a part of, or they're contributing, or that they have ownership of. And so bringing in your team, fully and wholly into these processes, finding ways to bring your community also into those conversations, I think is critically important. And like any culture, the culture itself has to emerge from the people that are participating. You certainly can set the signals, around norms and behaviors, but you have to also encourage those, recognize them, and incentivize them, to continue. Let me see if there's any other. So there's a question here from Hetal, who's our partner with SOPACT, about helping businesses choose impact indicators and what are some of the challenges faced in bringing them in. That's one of the ones that technology doesn't solve, right? In some ways we can provide education and breadcrumb people towards certain decisions, but it really embedding this within the context of our capacity building programs, where we're providing a lot of technical assistance and we're working, pretty intentionally with organizations over time to have them self-identify the SDGs, but then also come alongside them to help them understand which ones are most appropriate, and then which indicators are actually best indicative of their goals and the progress that they're making. We've had to wrestle with this idea of, even within our measurement framework, how do we create something that as many organizations and communities can participate in, so we can have flexibility, but also standardization. And I think with a lot of initiatives, that's a give and take. And so we're constantly wrestling and fine tuning that as well. Let's see. Jump back up here. Mary Jane, you asked about tangible resources to help guide in the building of data culture. I actually have someone I wanted to introduce you to, who I've had the pleasure of having some really great conversations with. So I'll definitely make that introduction offline. Wrestling with regional provincialism, skepticism towards facts, let alone embracing data culture. Wow, that's a big one to bite off here with a few minutes left. I think some of the way that we see disarming conversations around data is often by not even using the word data itself. It's similarly to how some people can be triggered by certain terminology that's being used and can opt out of a conversation before you even start. So, things like information, I do think that there's a fair amount of skepticism, rightfully, around data. But folks like Urban Kind Institute here in Pittsburgh, I know the work that's been done in Homewood with the Homewood Children's Village, these initiatives that have really been very intentional about embedding the data collection, analysis, and taking action process within the community, seeding that power within the community and allowing them to be the advocates and the stewards of that, have certainly led to great outcomes. I know that there's definitely a provincialism, as you mentioned, just in terms of who, how, and when people are willing to share data. I think from New Sun Rising's perspective, we learn by doing. And so I look at our work as a series of experiments. We often are putting things out, testing them, adapting and iterating from there. And so I also want to represent that we're not here with the whole solution and every answer to every question. We hope that there's something that you heard today that will maybe inspire you to both explore this more in your own work, but also consider how you may partner with us or how we may be an adjunct to the work you're doing. The last question I wanted to address or comment was, I believe let me find this here. Lou mentioned how to get involved with this initiative. Right now, it's really being offered for the initial group of nonprofits and social enterprises and collaboratives that we actually have been working with. So there is the first half of this year will be focused primarily on making sure that we have full data sets, that we're working, providing technical assistance to all of those organizations, and that they're being onboarded into the platform to have the best user experience possible, and then generating those data reports and storytelling that we talked about. We're currently fundraising and looking for more partners to add more capacity, because we, again, know that while technology scales and is certainly a big part of what we're doing here, without the human side of the data analysts, the graphic designers, the storytellers, we don't feel like we're going to put a holistic solution out there. And so part of this in scaling up is also looking for other partners who may want to share capacity in any of those positions or humans that we're looking to bring on board, and kind of row in the same direction. So with that, I know we're a little bit over time. I appreciate everyone being here today to learn more about the Power in Numbers initiative. We hope that you'll stay tuned as we're releasing more resources, more opportunities, and definitely looking and interested in your feedback in terms of how we might strengthen or work together in the future. So with that, please feel free to reach back out. info@newsunrising is the best email address if we didn't get to your question today, and we'll certainly follow up and continue this journey together as we hope to really build more equitable, sustainable, vibrant communities, and help you all continue to progress in the work that you're doing. So thanks again. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, and we look forward to hopefully connecting in the real world here in the months ahead.